I'm Bill Martin. Welcome to On the Banks. On the Banks is a fraternity podcast where we meet brothers, hear their stories, and celebrate the shared values of Phi Gamma Delta. Our topic for this segment is intelligence and national security. And we're fortunate to have as our guest David Priess, 1993 graduate from Illinois Wesleyan. David is a former CIA intelligence officer and daily intelligence briefer who now speaks and writes about the presidency, national security, and intelligence. He's appeared on major news outlets such as CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, and is the author of two books. First is The President's Book of Secrets, the Untold Story of Intelligence Briefings to America's Presidents, and How to Get Rid of a President, History's Guide to Removing Unpopular, Unable, or Unfit Chief Executives. David also is Chief Operating Officer of the Lawfare Institute. He earned his BA in Political Science from Illinois Wesleyan and his Master's and PhD in Political Science from Duke University. David, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for hosting this series.
Yes, sir. Well, I think this is going to be an interesting topic. To make our brothers better informed when they hear the news about intelligence and topics of national security. So along that line, the everyday citizen hears and reads often in the news about intelligence, a single word that carries a lot of meaning, and it's not a simple concept. So why don't you help us understand what intelligence means for the purpose of this conversation?
Sure. Intelligence is often misunderstood in terms of what it inherently includes and what it doesn't, but it also does have different meanings and different applications. So I'm going to focus on the United States way of doing intelligence because that's where we are. The purpose of intelligence in the national security meaning of the term, not the brain power meaning of the term, is to help inform decision makers to reduce the uncertainty they're facing when making those tough choices. In the governmental realm, that means the president and senior policymakers who have to decide what are we going to do in this complicated world full of threats and opportunities. But it also can apply to the business world in terms of making chief executive officers and other officers of a corporation, making them better able to understand the environment around them and better able to make strategic and tactical choices. In the governmental realm, which is where I worked, intelligence has two sides to it. One side is the collection of intelligence, and that involves getting information that often the bad guys don't want you to get. And so that can be covert collection, when you're trying to get information that is truly secret and you have to somehow steal it or convince somebody to give it to you when someone else around them doesn't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. But that is only there to serve the second purpose of intelligence, which is to actually inform policymakers about it. It does no good to collect information if you just sit on it and do absolutely nothing with it. Policymakers have two things that in the US system have come out of intelligence. One is decision-making, deciding, am I going to talk to this foreign leader or not? Am I going to move the fleet or not? Am I going to launch a military strike or not? All of those could be informed by the analysis of intelligence. The other thing they get to decide in the US system is covert action. Do we want to authorize the intelligence community to take some action in which they hope that the hand of the US government will remain hidden? So something will happen overseas, and it's something that helps US national interests, but it's something that will not be publicly acknowledged at the time by the US government. In our system, that's part of the intelligence business. Not every country does it that way. Some leave that in the hands of the military. But in our system, the collection of intelligence feeds both of those, the analysis that goes to policymakers up to and including the president, and covert action that may actually change some reality overseas for the benefit of United States national security.
Gotcha. So could you give us an example now, say a declassified example of when you talked about a covert action?
Mm-hmm.
right? Where at the time we wouldn't want or didn't want anyone to know that there was a hand, the invisible hand of the U.S. was there. Is there an example that you might be able to give us?
Sure. At any given time, the President of the United States may have several covert actions authorized that, of course, are very secret, or else they're not very covert.
Right.
So over time, many of those become declassified. Some of them by the very act occurring, and it's obvious something has happened and it points fingers at a certain country called the United States of America, more often because they are officially declassified by the US government. It is no secret that the United States government was seeking to overthrow or at least undermine the authority of Fidel Castro in Cuba for a long time.
Right.
And some of those efforts involved some covert actions that didn't turn out so well. Because frankly, Bill, the covert actions that turn out well, the government doesn't like to declassify because you might want to use those same methods again. The ones that don't turn out well usually are so obvious that they acknowledge it. So the most famous one probably goes back to the failed Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba, when some Cuban exiles were basically trying to take back the island from the dictator Castro, and they had assistance from the United States, but it was so big that it wasn't really covert, but it was small enough that it wasn't really effective. It was not a good covert action example. There have been many more successful ones that have gone on. Perhaps the most famous successful one, thanks to a guy named Ben Affleck, who made a movie called Argo, was the story of a CIA covert operation that helped get some of the hostages out of Iran by pretending they were part of a film crew that was scouting a location in Iran, and they smuggled those people out without the Iranians knowing. That's the good kind of covert action that we like to hear about.
Indeed, indeed. Where nobody's killed. Right?
You're right.
At least I don't think anyone was in that particular one. I saw the movie.
Yep.
Well, let's talk about your career in intelligence. First, how and when did you decide to pursue that career in that field?
Yeah, I knew even back when I was at Alpha Deuteron at Illinois Wesleyan that I wanted to do something involving international affairs. But like most college students, I had no idea what. I wasn't sure what that meant. I just knew that I wanted to go explore the world and do something involving this globe and its politics. I ended up going to graduate school, as you mentioned, in political science, focusing on international relations. And as I was finishing up my PhD, I decided I had to finally get a job and stop going to school. And I just happened to meet somebody who introduced me to the CIA. And I applied, I got in, and before I know it, there I am working as an intelligence officer. There was no great mystery to it, but the system has changed somewhat from when I did it. Back then, it was more, who do you know? Does somebody introduce you to somebody? Those times were largely ending by then, but it still happened my way. Now, that can still happen, but more often, people just direct you to the CIA website and say, find the application button and click there and get started.
Sure.
I think that's a good thing, because honestly, it means that people from all kinds of backgrounds, people from states and even universities that perhaps don't have access to Washington, D.C. and its people very easily, can still apply and get into the myriad jobs that exist at the Central Intelligence Agency.
Sure, sure. Well, maybe it was in your book. There was a quote from Richard Nixon. He was complaining that everybody at the CIA was Ivy Leaguers. He kind of had something against.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the old lines, Bill. One of the old lines about the CIA before I got there, but I've read it in books from the 50s and 60s. Was, and I can't remember the order that they tended to use, but I know these three words because they rhymed. It tended to be male, Yale, and pale. That is a lot of white men from the Ivy League.
Yeah.
And let's face it, that doesn't work for operations around the world. There are some places where the CIA needs to operate where being a well-educated white man, maybe that's inherently good, but you would stand out like a sore thumb if you're trying to do something that's covert. So you need a workforce that thankfully in America is easy, which is a workforce that looks like the world. even more important, you need a workforce that's diverse in thought and experience. You're not
Sure.
going to anticipate challenges overseas. You're not going to help policymakers like the president get ahead of challenges if you all think the same way. So there's something about having, whether it's racial or socioeconomic or gender divergence in order to get different points of view and better examine all the problems that threaten our country.
Understood. Understood. So then what about the path of your career with the CIA? You were there, what, 15 or 20 years, something like that?
Not even that long, closer to half of that. I just did a lot of jobs in a short period of time. You might say I can't hold a job. So I ended up doing mostly analysis, although I did have some work in operations as well. And I was able to do some things that were a lot of fun. I was able to analyze issues across the world for policymakers. I was able to brief senior policymakers to try to tell them something they didn't know about a particular problem set, maybe a foreign leader or a foreign country, because they were facing a decision and needed the best information we could provide. I was able to work as a policy officer. I did 1 year at the State Department, actually helping to execute the diplomacy of the United States. I served as a manager of other intelligence officers, but probably the pinnacle of my work there was as a daily intelligence briefer. That's where every single day you take the collected work of all of the other experts in the intelligence community and you deliver that to a particular senior customer. So the President of the United States historically has had a daily book of secrets prepared for him, the President's Daily Brief. There are only a designated dozen or so people, depending on the administration, whom the President allows to even see that book. And in modern decades, each of those designees gets an assigned briefer who will bring the material to them in the morning, talk them through it, answer questions about it, perhaps provide some additional information that relates to their portfolio, and make sure that they get the best thing they need literally to start every day. That was the job of a daily intelligence briefer. And my daily customers were the Attorney General of the United States at the time, John Ashcroft, and the FBI director at the time, a guy named Robert Mueller, who went on to do some other things in recent years.
This was in the Bush 43 administration.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And it was a heavy time because September 11th had just happened.
Right.
And it was a wartime environment. The war against Al-Qaeda was just starting and there were threats everywhere. And we needed the best intelligence we could get to try to stop another attack from occurring. And we did. We stopped many major attacks as a country on the diplomatic front, on the military front, on the intelligence front. But all of those were fed by getting as much information to policymakers as possible.
Right.
It was one heck of a job. There was a lot of responsibility, feeling like you had to get it right, because if you don't brief it effectively, lives could be at stake in the ultimate scenario. But it was also a job that was very rewarding because you got to represent the work of many thousands of people who were working very hard to collect information, analyze the information, and then you're the one who's communicating that expertise to the people who need it.
Yeah. Now, related to that many thousands of people, I was reminded in reading the President's Book of Secrets that there are 17 intelligence agencies in the U.S. government. And I seem to remember that was sort of something that was in the news after 9/11, as there was the talking, analysis, speculating about how did this happen, how did we not know about it, and so forth. And one of the things that was discussed at that time was we've got these 17 agencies. So it seems like too much, right? It seems like it would be impossible to coordinate. So is it too much, or even if it is, then and we got to live with it, then how does it get coordinated?
And I believe recently it's gotten even worse or better, depending on how you look at it, with the creation of the United States Space Force as an element in the US military. I believe that they are officially a new member of the intelligence community. So now we may be up to 18 different entities. Listen, there's a reason for it. I can't say whether it's a good or a bad reason, but it is a historical evolution that at least makes sense, which is you have various parts of the US government that have particular missions. The Department of State has a mission to formulate and execute foreign policy on the diplomatic side. You have obviously the Department of Defense, who has a military role, and each of the services have their own specific roles, whether it's the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Space Force, Marines, Coast Guard. The Department of Treasury, the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, each of them have some slice of national security that they in particular execute. It's natural for each of those departments and agencies to have an intelligence shop, because the Secretary of Energy dealing with some nuclear issues isn't going to have the same intelligence needs as the Department of Treasury dealing with a lot of financial issues. So you want to have your own specialists who can give you dedicated support within your agency or department. On the other hand, there are some issues that are cross-cutting, and they don't need to go to one particular cabinet secretary. They need to go to lots of people, up to and including the President of the United States. So we have an organization called the Central Intelligence Agency, which is an all-source intelligence agency that covers basically every topic like this. The US military has also designed a few organizations that cut across the services and help in particular ways, like the National Security Agency, which tends to focus on communications intercepts and other information that can be collected technically that way. There's the National Reconnaissance Office, which deals with satellites in space and collection of information with satellites. So you have this constellation of different agencies and departments. You're exactly right. Before September 11th, sometimes they didn't talk to each other very well. And sometimes it was more important to control your own silo and whom you were talking to than it was to share information across silos. And one of the big benefits of the 9/11 Commission, which did go back and look at the tragedy of September 11th, was to say, let's find a way that these agencies and departments can actually work better together to prevent a crisis that could have been avoided if people had the same information as another entity within the community.
Yeah, understood. It makes more sense now. Because, well, as you said, the thing that strikes me is both different armed services arms and different agencies or cabinet secretaries need different kinds of information and expertise. You can't get that all in one spot.
Absolutely. And what it does lead to is a case where some customers, as we always called them, because it's a customer service business, you're providing intelligence to somebody who needs it. Some customers get input from multiple intelligence agencies. First and foremost, the President of the United States. He can get information from any or all of these, depending on the day and depending on the topic. What happened after September 11th, but also after the Iraq weapons of mass destruction debacle, was they decided we need someone to coordinate the efforts of all of the intelligence community. That traditionally had been the job of the director of the CIA. But the director of the CIA was also director of the CIA. And you can imagine how the other agencies felt about that. So they created a new position called the Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, which now has a job coordinating, integrating the entire intelligence community, and essentially funneling information to the president himself to make sure that input from all of these agencies does get to the ultimate decision maker, the commander in chief.
Understood. Yeah, sort of a synthesizer.
You bet.
In a sense, sure. Let's help us understand how some specific examples of how the work of the intelligence community helps to protect America and its allies. Can you give us an example of a time when intelligence worked the way it was supposed to work and helped to avert a disaster or propel a positive outcome?
Yeah, I'll give an older example because it actually covers a lot of interesting ground. The end of the Soviet Union. You and I remember that well. There are certainly some undergraduates and even some graduates who may not, but that was the defining concern of the United States and national security for decades and decades between the end of World War II and the late 1980s, early 1990s. That didn't happen by accident. And it wasn't one single CIA covert operation that toppled the Soviet Union. No, the Soviet Union toppled itself. But what helped that to happen? Well, many things helped that to happen, some of which involved intelligence and in varying ways. One thing that has been pointed to that helped the Soviet Union collapse was their intervention in Afghanistan in the late 1970s, which led to a complete quagmire for them. And eventually they withdrew in disgrace. But after the loss of many lives and much treasure, there was a CIA covert action that was arming the rebels fighting the Soviet Union. So there was a contribution there to help that loss for the archenemy of the United States. But at the same time, there were spies collecting information from inside the Soviet Union about things like Soviet Union defense spending, about advanced weapons systems that they were planning to put online in the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond. And what that led to was the ability of United States defense planners to actually create their own competing systems for advanced fighter aircraft, for advanced defenses. Eventually, one of the programs in the 1980s was called Star Wars, but it was a program involving, could we have some kind of missile defense in space? Very expensive proposition, very difficult technically. We're still struggling with some aspects of it even today, but very expensive. We did know that the Soviet system was not doing so well economically, and they were struggling. We knew what kinds of systems they were developing on the defense front. We could develop systems that would essentially escalate that and make them spend even more. And when it came to the whole Star Wars thing, it's very easy to see if you're a Soviet leader, you've got the West, including the United States, spending like crazy on the military, and we can't quite keep up, and we see our own situation getting worse. Again, that doesn't lead the Soviet Union to collapse the next day, but it's a big contributing factor to how perhaps one of the most cataclysmic events in world history, which is an all-out nuclear exchange between two superpowers, did not happen. The intelligence was involved there on the collection side, getting information out of Russia, and it was involved on the analysis, letting policymakers know what the situation was like so they could make decisions, and on the covert action side in terms of something like going into Afghanistan. So it gives a good picture of intelligence and how it actually can work in a grand way.
Sure. So is there an example you can share with us where there was a lack of intelligence or a failure of intelligence that resulted in a bad outcome?
Absolutely. History is full of them, in part because we expect intelligence to be a crystal ball, to predict what's going to happen in the future. The world rarely works that way, in part because most people don't know what they're going to do next week, next month, next year. And if Vladimir Putin in Russia doesn't know exactly what he's going to do in a year, pretty hard for us to figure out what he's going to do in a year. So that's a hard bar to clear to actually predict some bad event. And yet we've done it. The United States intelligence community has had great success doing that. They've also had some failures. 9/11 is usually seen as an intelligence failure because the intelligence community was not able to tell the president or anyone else, Al-Qaeda is going to strike these targets on this date with these results unless we counteract them exactly in this way. Again, that's a high bar to reach, but having worked in counterterrorism at the time, it's something that still scars me. We were screaming from the rooftops that summer. We knew from intelligence coming in, a big attack was coming. There was no secret. We were trying to tell people, but the obvious question if you're a policymaker is, okay, so where are they going to attack and when is it so we can prevent it? And we'd have to say, I'm sorry, our intelligence can be exquisite sometimes, but it's not that good in this case.
Sure.
So the attacks happened and we were unable to prevent them.
Right.
Thankfully, we learned a lesson from that and we were able to do better in the future in terms of anticipating attacks and stopping them before they happened. But that's probably the most scarring event in my lifetime is the actual attacks on America from Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. What do you think will be the intelligence priorities in the next few years, in the coming years?
There's a few. The biggest one, which a lot of intelligence leaders talk about publicly, is the fact that the world is so much more interconnected and the threats are so much more diverse now than they've ever been. There have always been many threats. Even when the Soviet Union was the dominant threat, intelligence also focused on other targets. But now, I mean, you can imagine all kinds of things from other countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. You can imagine transnational threats like pandemics, as we've all come to know too well, terrorism, the drug trade, and of course, the climate emergency we're in and its effects on the economy and life for everyone. You also have issues that, frankly, are difficult to get at because they cross some of the issues we've come to take for granted, like the domestic terrorism threat. Is the intelligence community the best place to analyze whether some domestic extremists are going to storm the Capitol building? Well, traditionally, we've liked to have a wall around the intelligence community that says, do everything you need outside that wall. We will let you do things overseas to protect national security, but we don't want you doing things in the United States to Americans. So don't use your authorities to collect on Americans. Don't use your authorities to do anything illegal within the United States. If there's something that needs to be investigated in the United States, the FBI has some authorities to investigate that kind of thing, but we don't want our spies that work overseas doing that kind of thing here. Well, that does make it difficult if there is some transnational element. If there is some support or encouragement from another country, then you have to cross those silos again, where the CIA and the FBI have to cooperate, but within limits, because we don't want to be a country where we have a supercharged intelligence agency that can turn on its own citizens at a moment's notice. That does open up the opportunity for something like we saw on January 6th, where, yes, we do have a domestic extremism problem that the FBI is tackling very well, and a lot of state and local law enforcement is trying to get after. But we're not using the full resources of the US government to go after it, because we also want to protect the Constitution and the right of American citizens to express even extreme views without some kind of pressure or attack from the security services. That just ain't us.
Yeah. Understood. But it's a tough dynamics to balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure.
And it's not one that I'm thinking we'll ever get right, because there is no one right answer. There's always shades of gray. The good thing that everyone should know is this is an ethic that is held very strong within the Central Intelligence Agency that I knew, and I believe now as well, which is, we have extraordinary responsibility and we need to wield it effectively. And the ideas in these Hollywood movies about all of these, rogue officers or even an entire agency deciding to do something within the United States and, overthrow a governor or kick out a president, and that just doesn't vibe with my experience. With my experience, people are very careful about the authorities they have. And in fact, the rules and regulations in place, including some laws that are in place with criminal violations for doing things, you don't go that way. And some US government employees have lost their jobs, and some have been imprisoned for misusing classified information. Even for searching people's passport records without a legitimate government purpose can get you fired from a place like the State Department. So these things are taken quite seriously within the national security establishment. Yeah,
understood. Now, in your book, The President's Book of Secrets, it's about the President's Daily Brief, or PDB. You've touched on this a little bit earlier, but why is the PDB important? What is the real value of it?
Yeah, it represents two things, Bill. One is it's a microcosm of the entire intelligence enterprise. The goal is not to collect secrets because it's fun or because you might be able to use them later for some indeterminate purpose. It's to actually help somebody in a tough job do their job. And whether you like the politics of this or any particular president is irrelevant. As Commander-in-Chief of the United States, you want that person to be well informed about threats coming from overseas. The PDB is the finest example of that, because every day since 1964, the President of the United States, whomever he has been, has received the best analysis that the intelligence community can provide on the issues that they think will be most important to him that day. That's what it does. It is also important because it is a way that information that goes to the president can actually get to other people in the government. It's called the President's Daily Brief but it's never gone only to the president. And each president decides whom else gets it. And it's a way that that information can also help more effective decision making, not just by the president, but by the upper echelons of the US government, because the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, all of them will have access to this information that most of their underlings do not. It allows them to have very sensitive conversations about very particular threats. The PDB wasn't invented yet, but the PDB is the kind of vehicle that would be useful for the Cuban Missile Crisis that John F. Kennedy encountered, when he had to have a very small group of people who could debate what they were going to do about Soviet nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba without tipping the Soviets off that we knew about it, buying us time to think through it and debate what we were going to do. The PDB is a way to do that. Not all presidents have used it that way, but most of them have used it to help focus their thinking on what it is they need to do and whom they need to talk to about it.
So it gives the key decision makers a common knowledge, a baseline of knowledge.
A place to work from.
Cultural literacy. It's a form of cultural literacy that all the people in this group who are going to be together, figuratively or literally, in a room making big decisions, they have the common base of knowledge.
That's right. And it doesn't mean that they'll have all the knowledge they need. Very often with the PDBs that I delivered and those that I researched for other presidents, very often the piece going to the president and the others around him is kind of disappointing. The president wants to know, what do we know about what China is going to do on this particular issue this week? The analysts will collect the best intelligence they can. They'll put their brains together. They'll come up with what's most likely. They'll explain how they got to that conclusion. But sometimes it's, we don't know. We can't give you something with high certainty. We can tell you that these are the factors that would matter most. We can tell you that this is more likely than this, but we can't give you a point prediction. But even that is useful for the president and his advisors to sit around and say, hey, look, I'm meeting with the Chinese leader at the end of the week. We really want this policy outcome. And we don't have the certainty of their negotiating position to know how to get there. So we're going to have to try something else. Even that's useful for them to plan for it.
Right. Understood. So in writing the book, or in the book, you have commentary from former presidents, former vice presidents, secretaries of state and defense, CIA directors, other highly placed officials. In doing that book, I assume you interviewed some of those people in person. Were you able to get access? Who were some of the most interesting interviews?
Yeah, I got to tell you, I was blessed in this project that enough people held this president's daily brief, this thing that they saw that helped them do their job. Enough people saw that with enough esteem that they thought, yeah, a respectfully written history of this enterprise is worth me contributing to.
Right.
So I was able to get input directly from all of the living former presidents and vice presidents at the time, all of the living former CIA directors from previous administrations. And as you said, a whole number of secretaries of state, defense, and other senior government officials who had access to this book, going back to the Kennedy administration forward until the Obama administration, which is when I wrote the book. It was actually largely due to two things. One is I was clear to them, I'm not trying to expose real secrets. I'm from that world. I think there are things that do need to be kept secret, including the current contents of the president's daily brief. So yes, I'm writing a book that is a biography of this president's daily brief, but I'm not going to tell people what's actually in it. That sounds weird. It's like physicists trying to talk about black holes, but they can't tell you what's actually in a black hole. But there's a lot of interesting things we know about black holes based on what's orbiting around them. And that's the approach I took to this book. And I think a lot of people liked that. They thought, okay, this is a way to talk about national security and intelligence to inform the American people about where billions of dollars of tax money that go to intelligence ultimately end up and why it's a useful enterprise. But we don't have to risk the leaking of secrets that will actually cost American lives somewhere. So that's one major factor. The other major factor, how it was able to work, was due to George H.W. Bush.
Mm.
He was the former president of the United States. He, of course, had been vice president. And before that, he had been CIA director.
Right, sure.
He's somebody who really appreciated intelligence, and more importantly, really appreciated the men and women in the intelligence community who rarely get credit for what they do because it is such a secret enterprise. And when I went to him and humbly asked if he would be willing to answer a few questions, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. Yes. He answered questions to the best of his ability. He was nearing the end of his life, and he did not have the same communication that he'd had before, but he was able to give me some real insight. More importantly, he and his staff helped open doors to others. I had not yet cracked the nut of getting to Bill Clinton to agree to an interview. And sure enough, not long after the Bush 41 interview, suddenly Bill Clinton has agreed to talk to me. And I found that happened on several occasions, that I not only had someone who was willing to answer questions, but someone who was a fan of the project and willing to open doors, which probably explains why when the book was coming out, he actually wrote the preface for the book.
Right.
And was willing to put his name on it, which was an honor to me. And true to his character, he didn't write the preface about how great he was because he was the only person to run the CIA and be president. He used that preface to thank the people who normally don't get thanked for the hard work they do in the intelligence community. That made me feel good about this project.
One of those he's one of the presidents who has gotten his due as a class act since he was in office.
Yeah, and he's someone that I had briefed him when I was at CIA. His presidency was before my time, but as a former president, he received intelligence briefings. That is a tradition we have generally done in the modern era. And one day they sent me to go brief him on an issue that was in my area of expertise that he wanted to hear about. And so I got to chat with him then, and it was a delightful experience. He was a wonderful listener, very engaged, good questions. And then I basically didn't do anything with him for many years until the book came out. And then, of course, the interviews and all that. But, you know, he and his family were kind enough to invite me back. I saw him a couple of times in Texas, went up to the family compound in Kennebunkport once. And it was a pleasure to get to know him and Barbara a bit in the waning years of their life and get to see just what a remarkable person he was.
Yeah, good for you. That sounds great. It seems, was there a significant portion of the book that at one time was classified to this layperson reading it? It seemed that there was a lot of stuff in there that probably was classified at one time. Was that the case?
Absolutely. There are some things that were more distant in history that just over time, thankfully, our country has a policy of there will be no secrets forever. We do declassify things on a regular basis. So a lot of the early parts of the story from the 1950s and 60s and 70s, a lot of that has come out. In fact, anyone can go online now and read the actual content of the president's daily briefs from the 1960s and 1970s. Those have been declassified with a few redactions, they call them, or things that are crossed out, because those are sources and methods that are still in play today, even 40 plus years later. But you can actually see some of this. The other part was that even for more recent things, some things have been opened up. A dramatic example is a President's Daily Brief article that was written in the summer of 2001, not long before the September 11th attacks. The 9/11 commission that investigated those attacks had the opportunity to look at the president's daily briefs and other intelligence material. And when they were writing their commission report, they worked with the current administration at the time to say, we need to publish some of this as part of our report. And they were actually able to get the contents of a president's daily brief in full published for the first time. The other part of it, of course, was the interviews. The interviews of people who spent time with the book, including the presidents themselves. All of that I had to put through a classification review process as a former CIA officer to make sure that I wasn't inadvertently releasing a truly classified secret. I know that I had my head in the right place, Bill, because I went through that process, and it took a long time because it's a full book in which almost every sentence is about intelligence, and they had to look at it all. But they made no substantive revisions. They didn't find anything that was inappropriate to put out there. It still tells a good story and lets people in on something that isn't widely known. But in doing so, there was no chance of classified information getting out.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Good. If there are brothers who are like you were when you were an undergraduate and had, that sense, or any brothers who think they would like to look towards the CIA and intelligence as a career, what advice would you have for them?
I would say join the club, because when I was in the intelligence community, I did meet many brothers who were there from different chapters around the country. It's a representation of America. And
Yeah.
given the role that Phi Gamma Delta has in America, of course, you're going to have some representation in the intel community. I would advise go for it.
Mm-hmm.
It is an exhilarating experience. You have great responsibility, but you have some authority that comes with it. But it's also a chance to do good. And there are many ways to do good in this country, some of which are championed as public service, some of which are championed as military service, some of which don't get championed enough, like until recently, the healthcare system, and
Mm-hmm.
people not seeing them as the heroes that they are.
Mm-hmm.
But one way of doing that is to serve your country out of uniform by being a civil servant, by working in the government, whether local government, state government, or federal government. For me, with my interest in international affairs, going into the intelligence community was a natural fit for wanting to do public service, because you are contributing to the national security of the United States. Getting in is quite a process, as you can imagine. In order to have access to such secrets, they vet you very, very carefully. That doesn't mean if you've ever done something stupid at your chapter house, you won't get in, trust me. But they may ask a lot of personal questions and you need to answer them truthfully. That's part of the process, is taking responsibility for your actions and admitting what you may have done in years past. Once you're in, though, you have a whole range of things you can do. Just thinking of the CIA alone, Bill, you've got political scientists, you've got economic experts, you've got military technology experts, you've got engineers, you've got psychologists, you've got accountants, you've got medical doctors. You name a profession, even disguise artists are at CIA to help disguise some of our covert operatives overseas. Anything that you do probably has a job at CIA in one way or another. And it's a really good way to apply your particular skill set to something that's very important for all of us.
Yeah. So you couldn't say to someone, if you want to get a job in the CIA, prepare to do that, then you get a degree in this, right?
No.
There's so many diverse opportunities.
Absolutely.
Right.
For some of the most common jobs, there are things that are more useful than others. So if you want to be an analyst of, let's say, the Chinese political system, and you want to help educate the president, whomever that is in any administration, and other senior officials about China, well, kind of makes sense if you have a degree in Chinese history, or you have some Chinese language, or maybe you're a political scientist or an economist who understands the system of China. That would make more sense, perhaps, than having a degree in gardening.
Yes.
However, if you actually are someone who works on disguises, or you're a medical doctor, and you think, I want to apply that in a different way, there are jobs at CIA that will involve so many disciplines that, thankfully, there's a very useful website now that describes a bunch of those. So you're not operating in the dark and hoping that you have an interesting skill set. The recruitment center there will actually help you figure out if there's a job that applies to your skill set that you should apply for. So no, there's no one particular thing you need to do. But depending on the job you want to do there are some things that make more sense than others. The most common of which, of course, given the problem set that the CIA analyzes, is an interest in and perhaps experience in things international.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Okay. Now I've got a wild card question, and I hope you'll feel at liberty to respond. 2 days ago, on your Twitter account, you posted an album cover of the day. An album cover of the day. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I don't. I've been doing album covers of the day for quite some time now
Pet
on there because I listen to a
Pet
lot of
Sounds
music.
by the Beach Boys.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so when I saw that, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys was released in 1966.
Yeah.
I was 13 years old. I was might have been the first person in my town to buy the Pet Sounds album because I was a big Beach Boys fan at the time. But by my rough calculation, that was about 5 years before you were born. So how do you end up posting Pet Sounds as an album cover of the day?
Well, I'm a huge music listener, Bill, and I listen to music from almost every genre. And I don't know, there's something about music. Maybe it was because growing up, we still had actual albums. I transitioned to cassettes and CDs and electronic music over the various decades, but I still had albums when I started. And album art was art of its own. I mean, it connected you to the music in many cases, whether it was looking at the artist done in a stylistic way, or whether the band or the artist actually took the time to develop some art that related to what was in the music. Mm-hmm. And as I listen to albums now, and most days I will, while I'm working, be listening to some album, whether it's Ray Charles or Jay-Z or Genesis or Iron Maiden, I'll be listening to music all the time. And when I'm listening to it, if it strikes me that that's an interesting album cover, that becomes an album cover of the day that evening.
Right. Understood. Very good. Well, David, thank you for spending time with us today. And I'd like to let our viewers and listeners know that if they want to find out more about your books, they can do that at your website, davidpriess.com. Or if they want to follow you on Twitter, how do they do that?
Yeah, Twitter is the easiest way because I maintain that, and I find that people follow social media more than they go to websites, which is different than it was even 10 years ago. So yes, I'm on Twitter at David Priess, Priess, and I do try to still talk about intelligence and national security issues, along with occasional things like album covers.
Cover of the day. Very good. Very good. Well, thanks again.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your
pleasure.
time. To our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of On the Banks. We hope that as a result, you'll be a better and more informed consumer of news about intelligence and national security. There are many other interesting stories in Fiji land. We hope you'll join us again as we meet other brothers and hear their stories. Until next time, I'm mighty proud to be a Fiji.